Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Gosh, the light is very bright. I hope you guys can see me. So today, I know it's been some time since I last did my last video, and the reason is because I have been extremely busy and doing quite a number of things and been tied up with a lot of things, and you're going to find out just what in a couple of minutes. But it's been a rather interesting couple of weeks, and I have had a lot of things happen. And one of those things was that I had a couple of funerals that I had to attend. And I just thought that I would take this time to talk about grieving and the process of grieving and how important it is for us to actually take the time to grieve and how to go about it and how to work our way through it. Because I don't think there are many videos that cover this topic, and I don't think that a lot of people are aware of how important it is to be able to grieve. Yeah, so I hope you find this video helpful, and despite the topic, I hope you also find it a little bit hopeful as well. So let's begin. So today's topic is basically called The Notes on Grieving. Last month, I attended 2 funerals of family members within the space of a week, and that experience got me thinking deeply about grief, a topic that in many ways still remains a taboo. We do not talk about it enough, even though nearly every human being will encounter it in one form or another. Perhaps that silence is part of what makes grief so isolating, and that is why I wanted to research and reflect more deeply on it. Now, Dr. Julie Smith outlines grief beautifully in her book, Why Has Nobody Told Me This Before? She basically breaks down grief into different parts, making it easier to understand both for those who are going through it and those trying to support someone who is going through it. And the first step in understanding grief is to first understand what grief is. And the reality is, when we think of grief, we tend to associate it only with the death of a loved one, but people grieve for many reasons other than death. Some grieve the ending of significant relationships, the loss of family, friendships, livelihoods, careers, health, identity, or dreams they once held close. We grieve when the trajectory of our lives changes drastically, or when our future we imagine for ourselves is no longer available to us. I have seen this up close in my work with people with disabilities, especially those who have acquired a disability later in life. The profound loss of a future they once imagined often creates a deep psychological rupture within us. It is not simply the loss of physical ability they are grieving, but the loss of identity, autonomy, certainty, the life they once believed they would have. One of the biggest misconceptions people carry, and one that I have told myself at times too, is that if I am grieving, then I must somehow be failing at life. But grief is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of attachment. It is evidence that something or someone mattered deeply to us. Grief is part of the normal human experience and a necessary process we grow through when we lose something connected to meaning, love, identity, or belonging. And grief is far more complex than sadness alone. At its core, grief is often the deep yearning for someone or something that is no longer present. Relationships are central to human experience and to what it means to be human. And when the relationships end, whether through death, separation, illness, or life circumstances, the need for connection does not simply disappear. And we do not only feel grief emotionally, we feel it physically within our bodies as well. Everything we think and feel creates physiological responses within the body. Grief activates the stress responses in the nervous system, which is why grief can feel exhausting, painful, heavy, disorientating, or even physically unbearable at times. Understanding grief does not necessarily make the process easier, nor does it incite magically remove the pain. But understanding helps us sit with the pain more safely and compassionately, rather than fearing it or fighting against it. It is very natural to want to block out the pain, especially when it feels overwhelming. But the difficulty with suppressing one emotion is that we rarely suppress emotions selectively. Once we begin numbing painful emotions, we often numb joy, connection, excitement, and even tenderness as well. Some people numb grief by constantly staying busy. Others deny that anything has happened at all. And for many people, alcohol becomes a way to temporarily mute emotional pain. Unresolved grief can contribute to so many things like depression, emotional dysregulation, anxiety, addiction, and chronic emotional exhaustion. So while avoiding grief may feel protective in the short term, avoidance often intensifies suffering in the long run. The takeaway from this is to remember that grief can be triggered through endings, not just death. That grief is a normal part of being human, and that the pain can be both emotional and physical. So let's look at the stages of grief, all right? If you have done any reading or research into grief, you've probably heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross theory on the stages of grief, where she talks about denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. However, many people do not realize that her original theory was intended for terminally ill patients processing their own mortality, not necessarily for bereaved individuals grieving a loss. Over the years, psychological research has shown that grief is far more complex, fluid, and non-linear than a fixed sequence of emotional stages. Grieving does not happen in a predictable order or within a specific timeline. There are no universal rules about how grief should look. But let's look at the 5 stages of grief individually. Let us first look at denial. Denial and shock are not necessarily unhealthy parts of grief. In many ways, they serve a protective psychological function. They cushion the impact of overwhelming emotional pain and help us to absorb reality gradually rather than all at once. And that really helps us. Now let's look at anger. Anger is very rarely a primary emotion. More often, it is a secondary response to a deep pain, fear, helplessness, sadness, or vulnerability. When we allow ourselves to acknowledge anger safely, it can often lead us towards the deeper emotions underneath. Physical movement can help release some of the nervous system activation that anger creates. Talking to a trusted person can also help regulate overwhelming emotions. Now let's look at bargaining. Bargaining often appears in fleeting moments of what if or if only. These are the thoughts that will happen when you're bargaining. It is the mind's attempt to regain control over something painful and irreversible. Bargaining frequently leads to guilt and self-blame as we revisit moments repeatedly, wondering whether different choices could have somehow changed the outcome. And finally, let's look at depression, the one emotion that we always associate with grief. Depression within grief is often the deep sadness, emptiness, heaviness, and emotional exhaustion that follows loss. Recognizing these emotions can be part of a healthy grieving process that allows us to respond to ourselves with greater compassion rather than shame. And then we come to acceptance. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions about acceptance is that acceptance means approving of, liking, or being okay with what has happened. It does not mean that. Acceptance simply means that we are beginning to work to acknowledge reality as it is, rather than constantly fighting against the fact that it exists. And acceptance does not mean that grief disappears. It simply means that we have begun learning how to live with the grief differently. Grief often comes in waves. Some days we feel steady, some days we feel something is completely off. Other days, something small, a song, a scent, a memory, suddenly pull us back into the intensity of the pain. And that does not mean that we're going backwards. It simply means that we are human. And next, we'll look at the actual task of mourning, because mourning actually takes physical effort. Okay, let's talk about the task of mourning. Sometimes people forget that mourning is actual emotional work. Psychologist William Worden described 4 central tasks of mourning. To come to some level of acceptance regarding the reality of the loss. That's number 1. To work through the emotional pain of grief, which actually takes a lot of physical effort. And then the third one is to adjust to life and environments in which the loved one is no longer physically present. And next one is to find a continuing connection with the person while still allowing ourselves to engage with the life in the present, which, let's be honest, that is one of the most difficult things to do. Now, some people cope with grief by immersing themselves fully in the emotions, while others distract themselves, from it for periods of time. Neither response is inherently wrong. In fact, healthier grieving often involves moving between the two. This is because the mind and the body cannot remain in an intense emotional state continuously without being overwhelmed. So grieving often becomes a rhythm, moving between confronting the pain and stepping away briefly to recover strength. Feel whatever you need to feel. And that is the thing that we're going to address right now. It is okay to feel whatever arises while grieving. You are allowed to feel rage, sadness, confusion, relief, numbness, gratitude, joy, love, exhaustion, or even moments of peace. You are allowed to laugh. You are allowed to smile. There is no need to feel guilt for returning to life. Experiencing joy again does not mean that you have forgotten the person you lost. Love does not disappear simply because grief begins to soften. Take small steps forward every day. Do not underestimate the power of small steps. When grief is heavy, even basic tasks can feel overwhelming. Meet yourself where you are, emotionally, instead of where you think you should be. Healing often happens quietly.